Alex Gibney's new documentary, In Restless Dreams, the Music of Paul Simon, tells an epic story of show business that's also a reflection on mortality. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. For the past week, I've been in Copenhagen, holding live conversations at the festival CPH Docs. 2 days ago, my guest was Alex Gibney, who I first interviewed on this podcast 8 years ago, episode 16. Alex has a prolific career, and we touch on several of his films in this interview. He had his breakthrough as a director nearly 20 years ago with Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, about a deeply corrupt energy company. That set the tone for one strand of his career, exploring complicated stories of power and politics. He went on to direct Taxi to the Dark Side, about the U.S. program of interrogation and torture. That film won an Oscar. His other investigative works include Client 9, Mea Maxima Culpa, We Steal Secrets, Going Clear, 0 Days, The Inventor, and Totally Under Control. Alex formed the production company Jigsaw that produces the work of other filmmakers in addition to his own. Jigsaw has created several documentary series, including Agents of Chaos, The Innocence Files, and Dirty Money. Another strand of Alex's work are portrait films. Sometimes they veer critical, such as The Armstrong Lie or Steve Jobs. Some are rooted more in appreciation, even while grappling with complexity. Those films include Gonzo on Hunter S. Thompson, Mr. Dynamite on James Brown, and Sinatra, All or Nothing at All. That brings me to his latest work, In Restless Dreams, the Music of Paul Simon. Alex gained access to Simon as he was making his most recent album, 7 Psalms, that was released last year to critical acclaim. Alex uses the making of the new album as a framework to explore Simon's full career. Of course, that career first took off as Simon and Garfunkel. The duo had several years of hits, from Mrs. Robinson to Bridge Over Troubled Water, but their partnership was unequal. The lack of balance created tensions that split them apart. As we watch Simon in the studio now, we get to experience his process of seeking out new sounds. That quest has brought forth classic albums such as Graceland and The Rhythm of the Saints. Despite all his success, Simon remains deeply sensitive over the low points of his career that are also explored in the film. This biography is even more poignant because at age 82, Simon has suffered severe hearing loss in one ear that's kept him from performing this album live. I started our conversation by asking Alex, what did Paul Simon's music mean to him before he started this film?
He was the music of my life, in a way. I mean, going back to like 1964. So it was tremendously meaningful. And he had reached out to me. Weirdly, he had seen Sinatra, All or Nothing at All. There's a funny story about that. Maybe we'll tell later. And we started having discussions, like, is there a movie to be done? And then it really took off when he said, I'm working on a new album. And I thought, wow, 81 years old, he's working on a new album. And that turned out to be the key to the movie.
Well, that could be, that could go in a couple different ways. I remember you showed me the movie last spring, a few weeks before 7 Psalms came out, and I really enjoyed the film, but I was kind of waiting for the album to come out, because it's one thing to make a film about the making of an album that people really like, and it's another thing to have a 3.5-hour film out there about the making of an album that hits like a dud. Right.
Well, I was nervous about how it was going to be critically received, but I have to say that I had already made up my mind that the album was great. And I didn't necessarily expect it to be so, because I was in it for the process. Like, how does Paul Simon make an album? What does he think about it? How does he approach it? And this is one that came out of a dream. It literally came out of a dream. He woke up one morning and wrote down on a piece of paper 7 Psalms. You know, the dream said to him he should make a film called 7 Psalms. And Psalms is an interesting, idea or interesting word for Paul Simon. On the one hand, it's a prayer to heaven or a song to heaven. On the other hand, it's P.S. alms. You know, is this a gift? Paul Simon gift, and he's into wordplay. So it was really interesting in and of itself. And I think I had to, for commercial reasons, of course, you hope that it will be a commercial success. But as a filmmaker, once I got there in the middle of it, I thought, wow, this is really interesting and important.
I mean, these kinds of music portraits are now a big genre of documentary filmmaking. I wonder what are examples in this genre that you admire?
Well, I admire the ones that always lean into a story that is not the kind of Wikipedia version of someone's life. Gimme Shelter is one of the films I most admire of all time. And that's a film about music, but it's also a film about something else. It's about a film about culture coming apart, about both the responsibility and irresponsibility of artists, and it's a murder mystery. So I think that those are the kinds of music films I admire, the ones that dig deep and find something that you didn't really expect in the music or in the musician, because that's what, I don't know, turns my crank.
I mean, I was wondering, when you approach a project like this, what you see as your goal. Is your goal to make a film that Paul Simon is going to feel good about and tells his side of the story? Is it to reveal something that maybe hasn't been revealed about the figure at the center of your film before? Or is it...
I guess I would say...
Sometimes your films might be friendly, sometimes they might be adversarial.
Yeah, well, the job of a documentarian is to do the work. What is it Nick Fraser said in his book? Was it Say What Happened? I mean, you dig in and try to find the story. What is going on that's interesting and important? Of course, I hope that Paul would like the movie, but that's not why I was doing it. I wasn't doing it as a commercial. I was trying to see, like, what's interesting about this music, or what's interesting about the making of music? And ultimately, as I dug deeper, and also once I got a window on what he was doing, to me it ended up being about 2 things. One is about the process of making music. What is it that a musician like Paul Simon goes through when he's making music? But also the subject of the album itself, 7 Psalms, it's about mortality, and it's a debate about spirituality. Is it there for us or is it not? And this is at a moment when he's losing his hearing in one ear, so he's really facing that conundrum of, like, do I stop, or am I determined not to go gentle into that good night? So suddenly I felt like, whoa, this is really worth doing. It's like the film I did about Sinatra. To me, that was an assignment, because I wasn't particularly into Sinatra, but then I discovered something about him that was really remarkable. I mean, it's a kind of like a Great Gatsby story, and also the story of how he created his music and what it meant. That was really interesting. Finding Fela. This is this extraordinary Nigerian musician who pulled, by the way, from everything, including Frank Sinatra, and was this remarkable political figure who then, in his fame and fortune, lost himself and, ended up, creating danger for everybody, but created this magnificent music that was both part agitprop and part hymn to humanity. So in all these films, it's like you keep working it and working it and working it until you realize, oh my God, that's what it's about. I remember talking to Martin Scorsese one time about the Harrison film. He did
his film about George Harrison.
And, for him, that movie became about death. It was about somebody facing death and what that means. So you can look at that film and wonder, is that really what it's about? That's what it was about for Scorsese, and that's what made it, I think, deep. But you discover it as you go. It's the journey, right? Because if you go in, I would say that when I started my career, I would have an idea about what the film was about, and then I'd execute that plan. Those weren't good movies because it left no room for discovery, right? And also it made me rigid in ways that I ultimately learned wasn't that interesting, in the sense that you go where your initial conception of the film tells you to go. That's how they used to tell you to make documentaries, instead of finding in the material something special. And
was there a film where you felt you understood you were taking on this new process of discovering along the way?
I guess it started with, it started with a film that wasn't a music film at all, but it was Enron, and a few things happened in Enron. One was a kind of formal discovery that in this whole idea of a fraud were these notions of reflections, and then I could use that idea as a visual idea to cohere the film. The other thing was, it was inspired by a book called The Smartest Guys in the Room by Bethany McLean and Peter Elkind. But they spent very little time on California. But then we were suddenly given this material, not given, we found it and curated these incredible audio tape recordings, which at the time people said, you can't do anything with audio, it has to be visual. But these audio recordings were a window into depravity, the depravity of these Enron traders who were literally taking down the electrical grid in California for fun and profit. But we had the human face of that depravity, or the human voice of that depravity. And so we created a structure that exploded the original structure and leaned in to that moment. That becomes the moment to which we go, because you're looking for a drama. So it was completely different than my original conception, because it was something we discovered along the way.
In the case of Paul Simon, he's someone who's been filmed for the last 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
And there's a moment near the beginning of the film where he plays something for you, and you ask him how it felt to play that, and he says, well, I'm thinking about it in two ways. I'm thinking about the music, but I'm also thinking that there's a camera here, and that makes me a little self-conscious. And then you cut to an archival clip from him, probably 40 or more years ago, where he's in the studio, and someone asks him if it's okay that a camera is filming him, and he gives a younger person's answer, which is like, "Oh, cameras! I got cameras around all the time. I don't care if I'm being filmed." So here he is, around age 80, expressing a self-consciousness of being in front of the camera, compared to when he was younger, and saying he didn't care whether or not that was true or not. It's kind of an amazing moment to think about him being self-conscious about having a camera in the room when he's lived a life with cameras in the room.
Well, that moment, or that cut, that juxtaposition, and those two moments, it's in a way, it's kind of a key to the movie. Obviously, it's a recognition or an admission that what I'm doing is not fly on the wall. I'm there, and he knows I'm there, and that's always part of the process of being a documentarian. There's also the aspect of it, which is, as a young man, he says, it's so odd, this idea of photographing something. I spend all this time making images out of words and audio. Those are my images, and now somebody's photographing me doing that. So I found that like an intriguing introspective bit about his process. But I think also, to some extent, this is about a musician, and you're talking about playing. to some extent, I was playing him, and to a great extent, he was playing me, in the sense that he's showing me stuff that he wants me to see, but even in that process, that moment of exchange, he's allowing an intimacy that I don't think I expected. And also, I learned from his engineer, co-producer on the film, Kyle Crusham, that when we would come down, and we came down to, we filmed at various places, but one particularly at this studio he has in Wimberley, Texas, halfway between San Antonio and Austin. When we showed up, he brought it as a performer. In other words, it energized him in a way that he found valuable. And I don't know if he found it valuable consciously, but Kyle said, the level of his game came up, because, at 81, it's tough. He's losing his hearing in one ear. The muscles of his left hand aren't responding the way he wants, and he's playing a complex guitar riff. But when we arrived, it's like, fuck, I'm performing now, so I better bring it. So all those things are going on, and that's about the dance of subject and filmmaker.
A big part of his story is his relationship with Art Garfunkel. As I said in the introduction, they came up together as kids in Queens, had these years of success. But in that period, Paul Simon was the songwriter and had a big hand in arranging those. Art Garfunkel was the harmonizer in their duo, but didn't have as much a role, didn't have much of a creative role, which I take from the film, created different tensions, then add on to that the tensions of celebrity and success, and Art Garfunkel goes and has a career as an actor, working with Mike Nichols on films like Catch-22 and Carnal Knowledge, and all these stresses split them up. Paul Simon goes on to have a solo career. They reunite for this famous concert in Central Park in 1981. For fans, it's it's always been a little bit of curiosity. For anyone who loves that early music of them as a duo, there's, I don't know, kind of like a natural yearning for more of that, and it's a relationship that kind of comes up throughout this film, and I wonder how you thought about that as getting into it, because it's also it's probably an area of pain.
It was an area of pain, and I think it took a while to dig deep. I mean, I went back to Paul a number of times to dig deep about that pain, which I think he still feels very intensely about for all sorts of reasons. And same with Art Garfunkel. I interviewed a very few number of people for this film. I tried desperately to get Art, or there's three, he's known by three names, Art, Artie, and Arthur. And I was told, you don't want to meet Arthur. But he didn't agree ultimately to be in the film, but we went searching through the archive for interesting bits and pieces of his voice that could stand up to Paul, in effect, because I wanted to emphasize the conflict. But it's always an interesting story, particularly when you have two people who create such sweet harmony, to see such disharmony in their relationship. And, truth be told, most rock groups don't last that long. Clive Davis, of course, memorably said to Paul when he broke up with Art Garfunkel, said, "You're making the biggest mistake of your career." That was just before Graceland. So, but it's also, so it's an interesting story of relationships and how difficult it is to manage it, particularly when you're under the spotlight. And what we see as viewers and what we complete the meaning of the song, because these harmonies are so sweet and we want that to last forever, but personally they're not getting along. So it's perfectly human. But it's also an interesting story, within the broader story of his tale, which is that out of conflict, what is it Wynton Marsalis in the film says, without friction there's no motion. And out of conflict and to some extent failure, like their relationship failed, came the quest for something new, which, as filmmakers, I think is always an important thing to remember. Like, out of a film that doesn't work or a problem that you think is insurmountable comes the opportunity to go someplace different and to persevere, and out of that perseverance and what you learn from the failures, because sometimes what the head of Toyota used to say, and now I'm really free associating, and we should talk about free associating in a second. The head of Toyota used to say, mistakes are precious, because you learn from mistakes, right? And I think that each time there was a failure for Paul, I mean, he's intensely competitive, I think, but also he dug deep and think, why am I doing this? What am I doing this for? And maybe I should be looking for something different. Mm-hmm. So it turned out there was a lot of interesting stuff about that relationship. And Andy Grieve, let me give a shout out to my extraordinary editor, Andy Grieve, who's cut a number of my films. He found a moment at the end of part one. It's in two verses, verse 1 and verse 2, where Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, as young men, are sitting on a bed singing "Feelin' Groovy," a song that Paul doesn't like anymore. But it's very sort of sweet and pretty harmony. And Art Garfunkel is kind of scat singing, and it's the most loving moment ever. But over that moment, Paul is saying, that was a really great friendship. Somebody who really got me. That's a long way to go from there to somebody you never, ever want to see again. But it's the two things juxtaposed over each other that gives that moment a poignancy and poetry, because it's always both.
Well, there's another moment that I didn't remember from the first time I saw the film almost a year ago, but when I was rewatching last night, it struck me. Paul Simon is talking to his wife, Edie Brickell. They've been together for several decades. This is a contemporary moment where you're filming him recording something, and it's very brief in the film. They're sitting in a church.
Of a church.
During recording session, you're filming them from a distance, like kind of catching them.
They had radio mics on.
In a private conversation.
Yeah.
And Edie Brickell is asking him about the breakup with Art Garfunkel with a real kind of curiosity, like she's trying to understand it, and maybe think, hang on, they're having this conversation now?
This stuff doesn't go away. It turns out they're still talking about it, right? So obviously it's something that's still unresolved in some ways. And I found that really interesting. And sometimes, I've done a lot of films, seems like, in the past 10 years, where if you keep scratching deeper and deeper, it all goes to the relationship that somebody had with their mother or their father when they were kids. And there was some idle comment that Paul Simon's mom made to him. He said, you have a good voice, Paul, but Artie, he has a really fine voice. And it's like...
And this is something Paul Simon is still invoking today.
Yeah, and I think he thought, wow, man, I'm going to prove her wrong. Same thing with his dad. It's so interesting. Like, his dad was a jazz musician, right? So he grew up around a musician who's his father figure. He is, in fact, his father. But his father always thought that rock and roll was dumb. Like, what you do is just kind of dumb. It's not jazz. And Paul, I think... those two things stuck in his craw for a long time and were probably motivators, if I'm guessing.
Yeah, so talking about free association, when you say that, it makes me think of other figures that you filmed with Lance Armstrong or Steve Jobs, who had difficult relationships with their fathers or missing fathers.
Yep.
And this comes up a lot in documentary films and in any biography. As you dig deeper into biography, as you say, this is a recurring theme. And it really poses a challenge to me as a parent when you see in people's biographies that the most powerful driver in their life is what a parent withheld from the child. So
100%.
What's the lesson as a parent?
Well, I don't know. I mean, pay attention to being a parent. I mean, it's tough. And I know that...
Seems like the best thing you can do for your kid is withhold something from them.
I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe that's the thing that they're going to curse you for later on. My daughter, I know, and my wife and I argue, and of course we rarely argue, but we do from time to time.
It happens.
It's a very sensitive issue for her. She gets visibly uncomfortable, and she's got 3 kids of her own now. But it's because she remembers as a kid when we, had, let's say, more intense arguments. It really makes a mark on you. I'm just finishing up a film now that was kind of an unexpected labor of love. It's another portrait film about David Chase, the guy who created The Sopranos. So why do you think he decided to make The Sopranos?
It sounds like a daddy issue to me.
Mommy issue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was all about his mother. He wanted to make a movie about his mother and how crazy she was and how difficult it was growing up with him. And of course, I mean, the first couple of seasons of The Sopranos were about a mother who's trying to kill her son. So, he found an interesting way of working it out.
So here we are free associating. You wanted to say something about free association.
I did. Well, one of the things I learned from Paul, and it was interesting because I was discovering it in my own right in the cutting room over the last, 10 or 15 years, as we're talking earlier about, how did things change in terms of how you approach. Paul's approach, the later and later, when he wrote something like Sound of Silence, he sits alone, and we have this scene in the film, he sits alone in the bathroom, and the words just start to come to him, the words and the music, and it's like it flows. It's the way Bob Dylan talked about Mr. Tambourine Man, just flowed. Later on in his career, he felt as if he was more of a conduit. He would hear things, and they would flow through him in unexpected ways. He would hear phrases. He went to Joan Baez's house once and saw a photo, and the caption of the photo was Renee and Georgette Magritte with their dog after the war. He thought, that's an interesting title for a song. And he creates a song about a surrealist who's listening to doo-wop music. But it's that idea of letting something flow through you and not yet understanding what it means or how you're going to use it until you get down the road. And I've discovered over time, in the cutting room in particular, at a certain point, the film begins to animate itself and starts to tell you what to do. And you better listen to what it's telling you, or it's at your peril, because there's a kind of emerging flow and story that comes from random bits that you found and put together because you felt that they were important. And now you've got to make the decision about how to cohere that into a story that others can appreciate. So that ability to kind of free associate and to be unguarded and not too critical, which is the part, like when I do interviews, I very consciously try not to interrupt. I try to be as uncritical as possible. Now, with some subjects, that demands a different approach in the cutting room, particularly when people lie to me, and that happens a lot. But I think the ability to have that unguarded sort of curiosity and generosity, and to let things flow through you so you experience them in unexpected ways, and then you use your skill to kind of put them together. That I learned from this, because that's how he was writing Seven Psalms. It's how he wrote, like very famously, Graceland. I mean, he went to South Africa, and he's doing these jams with musicians and coming back with these musical tracks, and he kept humming over and over again, Graceland, Graceland. He said, this is bullshit. Like, what does Graceland have to do with South Africa? And then he decided to take a trip, and at some point the words wouldn't leave him, so he decides to take a trip up Highway 61 to Memphis to see Graceland. And he wasn't much interested in the house, but he went back in the back and saw the grave of Elvis Presley, and there was something deeply meaningful about that to him. And so it ended up becoming a song about a journey, and different kinds of journeys. And it all kind of came together, even though he found these materials in different places. And indeed, the drum beat for that track was something he recorded in Johannesburg. He didn't like the song, but he really loved the drum beat. And it reminded him of like the rumble of the train on the tracks, but also the kind of rhythms that Sam Phillips was recording in his famous Sun Studios studio in Memphis. When he was at the forefront of all these cross currents between country music and gospel and rhythm and blues, and so, wow! Suddenly, all these disparate elements come in. You're free associating, and then you give them form. It's long-winded, but anyway, that's a lot about what the movie is about.
You talked about the way Paul Simon used his adversities in his life to motivate him. And in the film, he talks about a period when he directed a film, One Trick Pony, that was not well received. And even today, he speaks of it with a kind of ruefulness, and like it still gets him that this film wasn't received. And I watch that and I think, like, you're Paul Simon. Like, why are you worried about a film that few people remember? But that any long career is going to have highs and lows in it. And I want, the first part of my question is, what did you learn from the way Paul Simon deals with his highs and lows?
Well, look, I mean, what's that line from that famous skit that cowbell skit that Christopher Walken does on Saturday Night Live? He says, I put my pants on one leg at a time, meaning I'm a famous person, but I do things just like everybody else does. Well, I mean, to some extent, that is, we imagine, like, why should you give a shit, Paul Simon, if you have a flop because you've had so many great successes? But it turns out the thing that drives people like Paul Simon is this kind of fire in the belly, like, oh, fuck, that didn't go over. What am I going to do now? Like, I'm washed up, and I got to dig deep. And, it's like that intensity. I remember an agent long ago when I was scuffling and couldn't get any movies made. I was a freelance journalist, and I interviewed Alan Ladd Jr., producer of Star Wars, but a longtime agent. And he said, the one thing, and I think he was for a while, he represented Barbra Streisand and a whole bunch of other people, very, very famous people. And they would always call him up, after their greatest successes in a panic, like, oh my God, I've had this great success, what am I going to do now? And he'd be like, what do you care? Like, you just had a great success, relax. And they're like, no, man, I'm in a panic. It said, turns out everybody's deeply insecure. And people who have great success also have deep insecurities. So, it turns out Paul Simon, like the rest of us, puts his pants on one leg at a time.
And I wonder how you've managed that in your own career, any long filmmaking.
Have I had any failures?
Career insights? Well, we call up IMDb.
No, man. I was recollecting the other day. I mean, I was lucky enough with a film called Taxi to the Dark Side to win an Academy Award. And it's like, great. But, man, to get there, that was a long, heavy road. The Sundance Film Festival rejected it. We didn't know what was wrong. Was this a film that would go anywhere? We had huge problems with the MPAA, they wouldn't approve our trailer because it was too real. The Discovery Channel famously, was gonna, had paid for some of it, but I learned through the grapevine that they found it too politically difficult, so they were gonna censor it. And I was lucky enough for Sheila Nevins in her wisdom sort of bought it 2 days before the Oscar, but it was a long and brutal and bitter road, and every step along the way, we had failure after failure after failure, and people were telling us, I probably shouldn't say this, but anyway, there were a lot of people who were saying, this is never going to work, and the film, by the way, is about torture. Who's going to want to watch that? And that proved out to be mostly true. It's a difficult watch, but important one. Anyway, the point is that it did, every step along the way, each failure taught me something special. And when we were rejected by the Sundance Film Festival, I thought unfairly, and I probably, like Paul Simon, probably still think that, but we went back and looked at the film and we realized, oh, fuck, there's a key structural flaw in the film that we've got to fix. And we went in and re-edited the last 40 minutes of the movie in a way that made it much, 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 much better. So out of that failure came some success if you're willing to look at the failure, like Toyota says, and know that mistakes are precious.
You talked before that a big theme of this film is mortality and what it means to stay creative in your later years. What was it like for you marinating in that theme for a long time?
Dude, I'm 70, so I'm facing the end of the road. It's not. I'd like to think it's way down the road, but if I'm being
if you look at the careers of documentary pioneers like Albert Maysles or D.A. Pennebaker, I mean, they.
No, it can happen.
You've got another good 20
I'm
years.
just saying there's a glimpse. There's a glimpse at the horizon, that's all. And so this film was very meaningful to me because it's something, it's not unique. We're all going to get there. It's the one, it's two certainties, death and taxes. So death is coming for us all. And how do we reckon with it? And there's a very poignant verse in Paul's 7 Psalms. It's called Wait. And he sings, wait, I'm not ready. It's like, well, I was singing along. Yeah, wait, I'm not ready. And so it was potent to see him reckoning with that and yet determined. And even now, he is determined to go forward. He's starting to write more music, and also he found in his adversity at a late age a kind of window into a different kind of a sound. And Wynton Marsalis, to some extent, was also advising him in that. It's like, leave the struggle in. Don't make it too pretty, because if it's too pretty, people won't hear the struggle that you're going through. And that's the soulful part that we all respond to, right? And so he's losing the hearing in one ear, which doesn't affect his voice that much, but it's hard for him to place his voice, particularly in a context where there are a lot of instruments. But now he's practicing, and he's getting ready maybe to take 7 Psalms on tour. He's going to see how it goes, later on this year, because he thinks he's found a way to recalibrate his hearing so that he can go forward. And it was interesting, I was talking about Dylan earlier and Mr. Tambourine Man and Sounds of Silence. There's a very famous interview with Bob Dylan that Ed Bradley did, I think, for 60 Minutes. And Dylan said, Mr. Tambourine Man, songs like That's All Right, Ma, I couldn't write those songs now. They just flowed out of me. I can't explain why. But I can do other things now that I could never do then. And so you learn over time to lean in. I'm a fanatical tennis player. So I'm discovering things now about the mindfulness of the stroke that if only I had known as a young man when I was trying to end every point, immediately, instead of leaning into the rhythm of the game. But it's something you don't discover till later when you allow things in your mind to change. So yeah, the going through the process of understanding this as a film about mortality, that was a key.
I want to shift gears for a minute and talk about the documentary scene and the difficulties right now in getting out into the world, the kinds of films that you've made a 20-year and more career of specializing in, films about politics and power. Jigsaw Productions, your company, has an enviable position for many documentary filmmakers. You've done business with almost every distribution entity out there, and you've been able to do some series that that are not just true crime and celebrity and food, but dig into investigative stories that are meaningful for a democracy for people to understand. How are you experiencing this moment when the larger media companies seem to be in retreat from these stories?
It's a very difficult moment. I mean, a few years ago, we were all talking about the golden age of documentaries. And in some ways that was true, because there was a level, and I would say still is a level, of extraordinary creativity and innovation in the documentary form. All the filmmakers here, every day I go in and see another exquisite film where people are digging deep and reckoning with reality and coming up with magnificent films in ways that when I was starting out you didn't see. Documentaries, by and large, were much more routinized. But those films are having a hard time getting seen because for all sorts of macroeconomic reasons and also internal business reasons, which, by the way, was a kind of tension in the film industry going back to the early days, right? There's always been the tension between art and commerce in film because you depend on the money. But now we're at a moment where so many of the channels, let's call them channels, feel like it's all about the channel rather than channeling the creativity of filmmakers, or particularly channeling challenging material that might offend some people, but would liberate and energize other people. And that over time, this David Chase movie. The other thing that was interesting to me about doing that film is that when David Chase wanted to get his film done,
his series, The Sopranos.
His series, The Sopranos. Well, it started out as a film, and then it became a series. But he took it around to everybody, and that was at a time that, in a weird way, is very much like the distribution modality right now, where the channels were about the channels, not so much about investing in creators. And he took it everywhere. And one famously, I think Les Moonves at CBS said to him, this gangster thing is cool, but are you wedded to that therapy thing? Okay, for those of you who don't know or haven't seen The Sopranos, the essence of the film is a therapy session. That is what it's about. So the executive was saying, the thing you like most, we want you to take that out. How would that be? He was like, no. But he found at a magnificent moment, HBO, which was investing in artists, and investing in artists because they had the passion, and because that passion would then translate to audiences. Not all audiences. Some people would hate The Sopranos, and it was vilified by a lot of people, because it was too violent or too this, but many people loved it. So investing in the passion of creators, that I think is incumbent. But we can't wait for that. So, at this moment, I think that there are audiences now that have been created for the documentary, and they like challenging stuff. So I would implore the streamers to invest in the passion of creators, but I would also say to those of us who are creating movies that it's time to start digging into other distribution mechanisms to be able to make those films more freely available. And Europe is a bit different still than America, but we went through a brief period where, after years in the wilderness, my wife used to warn me, whatever you do, you need to get a job. And if you go looking for a job, please don't tell them that you're interested in documentaries, because they won't hire you. So I was like,
are these the arguments that traumatized your daughter?
Yeah, yeah, they were always about money, and I wasn't making much money at all. I mean, as you know, my documentary career started very late. I think I made Enron when I was 50. In the past few years, a lot of us got paid and got paid well, and it was great. But now the solution is not to lean more into documentary celebrity commercials, but to try to find ways of making interesting films and looking to ways to get them out to viewers who are really interested in seeing them. And that may require some innovation and creativity.
Can you illuminate what's changed in the conversations you have with bigger distributors? Because in the last 5 years, you were going into those large companies and making series like Dirty Money that were speaking truth to power stories. So what was happening then that would get those projects greenlit, and what's changed?
Well, I think that to some extent the philosophy has changed at some places where they used to be more invested in what I would call communities of interest, like where some people felt very passionately about stuff, and so that was a reason to subscribe to the service, as opposed to just feeling pretty good about everything. So there's that. But then I think also, if you're only looking to get the biggest numbers possible, then you don't want to offend anybody. So I've had conversations with some commissioning editors where it's like, I did a film called Citizen K. Actually, Alexei Navalny was in it prior to the Navalny film, and it was about an oligarch named Mikhail Khodorkovsky who was imprisoned by Putin for 10 years. And I had some difficult conversations with gatekeepers who said, we don't really want to offend Russia. Well, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, it's like, oh, okay. So speak power to truth then. And that was mind you, that was pre-Putin taking over, and that was pre-Ukraine. But still, it's like, well, I'm not sure, at the end of the day, there is a social responsibility that these outlets have to broaden the conversation about life. This is what we're doing. We're documenting what's going on all around us, and because we expect that free flow of information to make a difference. Well, if you began to start constricting that free flow of information to only films that won't offend anybody, well, fuck that. Just my personal opinion.
I want to thank Alex Gibney for speaking with me. His new film, In Restless Dreams, the music of Paul Simon, is now streaming on MGM+. Thanks to the team at CPH Docs in Copenhagen, where this conversation took place as part of their industry conference. It was great to catch up with so many filmmakers and meet people who listen to the podcast. Shout out to filmmaker Sarah McCarthy, who tells me she listens while multitasking. Seems like she catches about half of it. Well, Sarah, I hope you hear this part. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, newsletter manager Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive director is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.